your first time with us, or if it's one of your first times, I want to tell you about something real quick, then we'll move on. I do this every time we have one of these coming up. But next Sunday after this service, we have a lunch called Welcome to Midtown. We would love to see you there. If you've been checking things out, you want to know more about our church, know more about how things work, or just ask questions, meet some of us. It's an opportunity. It's free food, and childcare is included also. So all those things that would prevent you from taking a step or knowing more, all of that, hopefully, we have taken care of for you. In fact, you could pull out your phone right now and sign up. We like to know how many are coming for obvious reasons. We want to make sure that we have plenty of food. And if you miss this one, there will be another one. We're so excited each time one of these rolls around. Does anybody, I'm 45, I think I'm 45. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate. I've been doing this thing recently. So my whole life, I've had really, I don't mean to brag, but I've had really good vision. I don't have to wear anything and my wife does not have good vision. And so it's one of the few things I can brag to her about where I'm like, oh, I can see that just fine, right? In fact, I went for an eye exam probably 20 years ago and they were like, you should have been a pilot. And I'm like, right? I know. It's like finding out you have a superpower, but no one told you. It's like, oh, I could have been Vision Man. But now, that's not even a good superpower. But now I'm doing the thing where, and please don't repeat this. I'm doing the thing where I'm like, because my eyes are like, when I go to look at my phone or a book, my eyes are like, we don't do that anymore. They're just on strike. They're like, my eyes are not so good. Something interesting. Moses, at the end of his life, something that seemed really important to him was for you to know, for me to know, for us to know that his eyes were really good. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, he's 120 years old. And we find him, of all things, climbing a mountain at 120. Now, imagine this, 120 years old, climbing a mountain. Behind him is his entire lifetime. Egypt, the palace, the murder, the escape, 40 years in Midian, the burning bush, the voice from the fire, the staff from his hand, the return to Egypt, Pharaoh, 10 plagues, blood on doorposts, the mass exodus, the cries of Egypt in the middle of the night, the sea splitting open, and the sea swallowing up the army. And then behind him, 40 years of wilderness. As we see him in Deuteronomy 34, sitting on top of this mountain, there's 40 years of Egypt, 40 years of wilderness behind him, 40 years of dust, 40 years of manna, 40 years of complaining, 40 years of leading people who repeatedly wanted to go back to Egypt. He's got all that in his rear view. He's buried friends. He's buried a generation. He's experienced disappointment. He's experienced grief. He's experienced failure. He's experienced loss. He's sitting on this mountain alone with God. And he's remembering the times that he came down from the mountain, back to chaos. He watched people worship idols. He begged God for mercy on their behalf. He's experienced the glory of God. Glory so intimate that his face shone. They had to make him wear a veil. And now, 120 years later, he's sitting on this mountain alone with God. 120 years after his story began, the last time he'll climb a mountain. This mountain is called Mount Nebo. And I love in this scene what God says to Moses. He says, look, Deuteronomy 34, Moses climbed Mount Nebo, it writes, from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. And then the Lord showed him the whole land. 120 years after his story began, Moses climbs a final mountain just to sit alone with God. And God says, Moses, look. One last time. Look. And God begins showing him everything. All the land, all the territory, Gilead and Dan and Naphtali and Ephraim and Manasseh and Judah and the Negev, the Jordan Valley, Jericho, that they'll cross into one day. There it is, the promised land. The land God first promised to Abraham generations before. The land Moses spent 40 years walking people toward. The destination to which his entire life had moved and had been moving. And now from the top of Mount Nebo, he can see it, but he won't enter it. God tells him, I've let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. Can you imagine that? Standing there, sitting there with Moses, looking at something you've spent 40 years of your life moving toward, knowing somebody else is going to finish what you started, knowing Joshua is going to be the one to lead them across. Another generation will inhabit the land. The story will continue without you. And then Moses dies right there in Moab. Deuteronomy says that God himself buried Moses. No monument, no tomb, no shrine for Israel to visit. Just the end of a long life. And before the writer moves on in Deuteronomy 34, before Joshua takes over, before Israel crosses the Jordan, Deuteronomy gives us one more little detail about Moses. One sentence, and I cannot get past it. And some think that Moses wrote this autobiographically before he breathed his last. And the last thing he wants you to know about himself is Moses was 120 years old when he died. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. Other translations put it this way: his eye was undimmed. His eye was undimmed. After 120 years, after Egypt, after Midian, after Pharaoh, after the Red Sea, the wilderness, the disappointment, the failure, after years of carrying the weight of leadership, after arriving at the edge of something he desperately wanted and knowing he would never be able to finish it, his eyes were still not dimmed. And I don't mean just physically, because there's another sentence written about Moses. Hundreds of years later, the author of Hebrews would pen a sentence about this extraordinary life and tell us a secret of how Moses kept going all those years. Hebrews 11, verse 27 says that Moses persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Come on. He saw him. He persevered because he saw him. Maybe that's the story of Moses, a story of a man who spent 120 years just learning how to see. By the time he reached the end, his eyes were still not dim. Well, of course they weren't. So here's the question I want us to wrestle with this morning. How do you live through everything that Moses has lived through and still have your eyes? How do you experience disappointment without becoming cynical? How do you experience suffering without becoming bitter? How do you go through the wilderness? Moses walked through the wilderness. How do you live through that wilderness and still not lose sight of God? Or maybe another way, how do you endure things that you never wanted? How do you lose things that you desperately loved? How do you accept endings that you would not have chosen and somehow still see? And I think it's that maybe perseverance doesn't actually begin in your feet the way we think it does. Maybe perseverance begins in your eyes. And maybe the secret to making it through the wilderness is learning where to look. We're nearing the end of a series we've been calling Big Faith. And in this series, we've been saying that we think God's will for us is to have a really big faith. And not just a faith that lives in our heads, but a faith that inspires the way we live, that helps us make choices as we navigate life. We think that God wants this for you. We think that Jesus wanted this for his disciples and for his followers. And today we've been studying the book of Hebrews as sort of the model for that. All throughout Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews has said, this is how you live by faith. And then in chapter 11, something that you may have heard called before the hall of faith, the author stops and lists person after person after person who exemplified, who illustrated, who modeled great faith in the Old Testament. And 2 weeks ago, we met a baby named Moses. Last week, we saw him become a man who had to make a decision about how he would follow God in this lifetime. And today, we're going to see how he looked back now on his life from the end. And if you're anything like me, you've wondered, because when you look at Moses, you tend to wonder, how did this man make it through all of that and still have his eyes? How did he endure Pharaoh? How did he experience 40 years in wilderness? How did he endure failure and disappointment and heartache and anger and loss and somehow still reach the end of his life looking at God? Because everybody gets tired. Everybody gets discouraged. Everybody thinks about throwing in the towel. Everybody reaches moments when it feels like quitting is easier than continuing. So what kept Moses going? If anyone had reason to quit, it's him. Was he just more put together than everybody else? Is he just more impressive than anybody else? Is he more determined? Does he possess some kind of extraordinary willpower that maybe the rest of us don't have? The writer of Hebrews seems to say no. That's not what it is for Moses. And in one sentence, the writer of Hebrews tells us Moses' secret. This is Hebrews chapter 11, same chapter, verse 27. The author says that by faith Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered, and here's the reason why, because he saw him who is invisible. Now, this verse is fascinating because it tells us what Moses did. He left Egypt. He wasn't intimidated by the Pharaoh's anger. He persevered. But then Hebrews tells us why. It says it is because he saw him who is invisible, which is a strange sentence. How can you see someone who's invisible? How do you look at someone that you cannot see? The author of Hebrews is fascinating. He could have said that Moses persevered because he was courageous. Moses persevered because he was determined. Moses persevered because he had grit and resolve. He doesn't say any of that. He says Moses persevered because of what he saw, which tells me something, that the secret to perseverance isn't found primarily in stronger willpower. It's found in clearer vision. Faith isn't just believing the right things. Faith is learning to see reality differently. All of it. Not denying what's visible, but recognizing that what's visible is not all there is. Pharaoh was real. The Pharaoh's anger was real. The armies were real. The Red Sea was real. The wilderness was real. Moses saw all of it. He just saw someone greater. Right? So faith doesn't require you to close your eyes to reality. Faith, as Moses would learn, requires you to open your eyes to a greater reality. And this has been true of this entire series so far. Abel saw a sacrifice differently than the way Cain saw it. Enoch walked with a God that nobody else could see. Noah built an ark because of a judgment that he could see coming and no one else could. Abraham left because he saw a city, the author says. He saw a city whose architect and builder was God. Sarah considered God faithful when all visible evidence said otherwise. Moses' parents looked at a helpless baby and saw a life worth risking everything for. Again and again through this chapter, faith has been another way of seeing. And now Hebrews says that Moses persevered because he could see an invisible God. Now, here's the question. How did Moses learn to see an invisible God? Right? Because this doesn't happen overnight. Nobody wakes up one morning with unshakable faith, right? Faith is formed, it's cultivated, it's learned. Moses didn't see the invisible God because he possessed some sort of extraordinary eyesight, like me 20 years ago. He didn't just have this skill. He saw the invisible God because God spent decades teaching him, training him where to look. And when you look closely at Moses' life, this is extraordinary. You can literally see this happen. You can watch this happen. You can watch a frightened, impulsive 40-year-old man slowly turn into the 120-year-old man sitting on top of Mount Nebo with God and undimmed eyes. See, God did this in Moses' life in 3 40-year classrooms. When you think about Moses' life, there's 3 40-year classrooms at play. Acts chapter 7 divides his life into these 3 chapters: 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and then 40 years in the wilderness. 120 years, 3 classrooms, 120 years. Each classroom taught him something different. Egypt taught him about the power of man. Here's what man is capable of. Here's what you're capable of, Moses. Midian taught him about the sufficiency of God, being alone out there in the desert. And then the wilderness taught him to trust God one day at a time. To say it another way, Egypt taught Moses to see the limits of human strength. Midian taught Moses to see the presence of God. We're going to unpack that in a minute. And the wilderness taught Moses to keep seeing, even when nothing seemed to change. In Egypt, Moses learned that what's powerful is not ultimate. In Midian, Moses learned that what looks ordinary can also be holy. And in the wilderness, Moses learned that what's impossible or what looks impossible is not impossible for God. In other words, see the limit of yourself, see the presence of God, and keep seeing God. In Egypt, when Moses lived in Egypt, he thought that his answer for everything was his own strength. He had the best education. He had the best training, the best opportunities. He thought he could deliver Israel. In fact, Acts tells us that he thought that he could actually deliver Israel at this point in time. He saw an Egyptian beating another Egyptian, a Hebrew slave. So he steps in and he kills the Egyptian and buries his body there in the sand. The next day, he steps out to try to settle an argument between 2 Hebrews who indicate they've seen his crime. And they say, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You going to kill one of us like you did yesterday?" And just like that, Moses goes on the run. 40 years of privilege gone, disappeared overnight. He goes to a place called Midian. He runs to Midian, not because he's leading Israel, but because he's a coward. He's hiding. This is Moses hiding. You may have noticed something in that verse in Hebrews. It says that Moses left Egypt not fearing the king's anger. But Exodus tells us that Moses fled because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So which is it? Scholars have wrestled with that question for a long time. Some believe that Hebrews is describing Moses' first departure from Egypt when he left Midian. Others believe they're describing his second departure, the Exodus. I actually love that possibility because if that's what Hebrews is describing, just look at the contrast. It makes you ask, what happened in Midian? The first time Moses left Egypt, he's 40. Pharaoh wants him dead and he's afraid. The second time Moses leaves Egypt, he's 80. Pharaoh wants him dead and Moses walks out with an entire nation of people behind him. What happened in Midian? Same Pharaoh, same threat, same Moses, different eyes. What happened? Midian happened. Midian happened. 40 years happened. 40 years in a desert. 40 years of obscurity. 40 years in which God was doing something in Moses that Moses couldn't see in himself. Moses wasn't, this is important, he wasn't born fearless. Many of us write him off as like, well, I guess you're just born that way. Oh, no. Moses wasn't born fearless. He became faithful. And maybe that's good news for somebody here. Maybe you've spent your life looking at people with greater faith than you and you go, oh, I wish I could have that kind of, I never could have faith like that. Maybe they didn't used to have it either. Maybe faith isn't something some people have and the rest of us don't. Maybe faith is something God forms in us as we learn to see him. Maybe it's something he's doing and cultivating in us. For Moses, the next classroom was Midian. The Moses who fled Egypt at 40 is not the same Moses who returns to Egypt at 80. Somewhere in those 40 years, God changed Moses. God changed what Moses feared most. And isn't it true? Sometimes God has to dismantle our confidence in ourselves before he can build our confidence in him. Because Egypt taught Moses how powerful Moses was. and how limited Moses was. Midian taught Moses how faithful God is. And sometimes God loves us too much to allow us to keep confusing the two. This doesn't require me. This is requiring you, God. I am dependent on you. Oh, we spend the first 40 years dependent on ourselves. You see where that gets you. For Moses, he needed 40 more years of desert. 40 years. For 40 years as a shepherd, nothing spectacular happened in Midian. I wish I could tell you a better story. There's no miracles, no plagues, no Red Sea, no crowds, just sheep. Sheep. Smelly sheep, day after day after day, year after year after year. You let the sheep out, you watch the sun come up, you follow sheep around, you let the sheep back in, you watch the sun go down. Day after day, year after year after year. Can you imagine this? The man who, he was educated to run an empire, to rule an empire. He now spends his days counting sheep. That's his job. The prince becomes a shepherd. And maybe that's where God wanted. Maybe it's exactly where God wanted him. Because shepherds learn things that princes never learn. Shepherds learn dependence. Shepherds learn patience. Shepherds learn to notice. Shepherds learn to follow. The desert has a way, doesn't it, of stripping away the noise. The second chapter for Moses, there's no palace. There's no applause. There's no ambition. There's no distractions. Just the quiet rhythms of an ordinary life. And God. Just God. And isn't it true that sometimes that's exactly what we need? Because we spend so much of our lives asking God to change our circumstances when all the while he's trying to change our sight. We ask him to remove the wilderness. He wants to teach us how to see him in it. Maybe the greatest thing God did for Moses in Midian wasn't preparing him to lead Israel. Maybe it was teaching him to recognize the presence of God. Because on one of those ordinary days, one of those dusty, ordinary, normal days, just following around smelly sheep while tending sheep, Moses notices a bush. It was burning, but it wasn't burning up. And Exodus says something that I don't want to miss. Moses says, I will go over, and notice what it says, and see this strange sight. He turned aside. He looked. He paid attention. And then the text says, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush. Did you catch that? Moses saw. Moses turned aside, Moses looked, and when God saw him seeing, then God spoke. Now, I wonder how many burning bushes we walk past all the time because we're so busy, because I was too busy to turn aside and notice. How many times has God been present and I've been too distracted to even notice? How many holy moments have I missed? Because I was looking for something spectacular while God was waiting for me in something ordinary, a conversation, a passage of scripture, a phone call, a walk, a child, a meal, a moment of silence, a bush. Because here's what 40 years in the wilderness had done to Moses. Egypt taught him to act. Midian taught him to notice. At 40, Moses saw suffering, and he immediately took matters into his own hands. He killed a guy. At 80, Moses saw something he didn't understand, and he stopped. Turned aside to look. And you guys, that's growth. That's formation. That's what God had been doing in Moses for 40 years. God wasn't wasting Moses' life in Midian. He was training his eyes to notice. Before Moses could see God make a way through the Red Sea, Moses first had to learn to see God in a bush. Before he could recognize God's presence in the extraordinary, he had to learn to recognize his presence in the ordinary. And maybe that's where learning to see begins for Moses. Maybe it's learning to pay attention. So this bush is burning, but it isn't burning up. And I don't know, the text doesn't tell us how long it had been burning. But Moses, he notices, he stops, he pays attention, he turns aside. Moses is staring at this bush, and God sees Moses looking at this bush and says, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. And before God ever asked Moses to do anything, notice this, before Pharaoh, before the Red Sea, before the plagues, before the Exodus, before any assignment whatsoever, God says, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I love this because Moses' first lesson is not mission. His first lesson is worship. Because before God could teach Moses what to do, he wanted Moses how to recognize where he was. Holy ground. This is holy ground. Before any assignment, Moses, how about just stop and notice? Presence. Moses, before you could do something for God, you have to learn to be with God. And isn't it true that our work for God must always flow out of our life with God? How many times has God been speaking and we missed it? And if we don't sink into that Moses moment, if we don't pay attention to his presence, we miss God. We're not going to do anything for God if he's not flowing through us. How can we miss God? Most of us, isn't it true? Most of life isn't the Red Sea. Most of life isn't plagues. Most of life is not mountaintops. Most of life is sheep. Long days, stinky animals, getting up, going to work, making dinner, driving those kids around. Having conversations, doing laundry, going to school, sitting in traffic, walking the same road you've walked 1,000 times before. Ordinary days, ordinary places, ordinary moments. And we spend so much time asking God, why aren't you doing something spectacular? Maybe a better question is, God, where are you in what I'm already doing? Because the miracle wasn't simply that there was a burning bush. The miracle was that Moses became the kind of man who would stop and notice, who would turn aside, who would look. Think about the difference. 40 years earlier, he kills a guy. Now he just stops. He sees something he doesn't understand. He looks and he listens. God had been training his eyes through 40 years of sheep, 40 years of obscurity, 40 years of ordinary life. None of it has been wasted. God was forming Moses into the kind of person who could recognize his presence. Because before Moses could see God make a way through the sea, he had to learn to see him in a bush. Before he could recognize God in the extraordinary, he had to see him in the ordinary. And maybe that's one of the greatest gifts that faith gives us. Faith teaches us to pay attention, to look again, to turn aside, to stop, to consider, to recognize that the invisible God might actually be closer than we think. Midian taught Moses to notice. Moses still, though, has one more classroom, because it's one thing to notice God in a burning bush. It's another thing entirely to keep seeing him when you've been staring at the same wilderness with the same complaining people for 40 years. That's the next chapter. Think about what happens next. Moses goes back to Egypt. He stands before Pharaoh. God delivers his people. They walk out of slavery, and almost immediately they arrive at the Red Sea. Water in front of them, Pharaoh's armies behind them, nowhere to go. And the people start to panic, because that's what happens when fear fills your vision. All they can see is the sea. All they can see is the Pharaoh. All they can see is an impossible situation. And then Moses stands up before them and says something remarkable. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. There it is again. It's Moses saying, don't just look at Pharaoh. Hey, eyes up here. Don't just look at the Pharaoh. Don't just look at the sea. Don't look at what's coming behind you. Look at what God's going to do. Look at what he's about to do. And then the sea opens. They walk through on dry ground. Pharaoh's army is swallowed behind them. And you'd think that something like that, after something like that, they would never doubt God again. But they do. Of course they do. Because faith isn't usually learned in one spectacular moment. Faith is learned over a lifetime. And so they walk into the wilderness and they're hungry and God gives them manna. They're thirsty, God gives them water. They don't know where to go, so God leads them day after day after day. And I love how God does it. Exodus says his presence went before them during the day as a pillar of smoke and at night a pillar of fire. Think about that. This God who is invisible gives his people something visible to remind them that he's there. A cloud by day, a fire by night. When they wake up in the morning, there's God. There he is. When they go to bed at night, there he is. When he moved, they moved. When he stopped, they stopped. When they didn't know where they were going, they didn't have to. They only had to keep their eyes on the presence. And maybe that's what now God is teaching Moses. Maybe that's what the wilderness is teaching Moses. That you don't have to see the destination if you can see the one who's leading you. Come on. You don't have to see the destination if you can see the one. We spend so much of our lives asking God to show us where we're going. Show me the plan. Show me how this works out. Show me what's going to happen. Show me what's on the other side. God, show me the promised land. And sometimes God doesn't. Sometimes he just gives us enough light for today. Enough bread for today. Enough grace for today. Enough presence for today. That's the wilderness for Moses. Yesterday's manna won't feed Moses today. Tomorrow's manna hasn't fallen yet. So every morning you wake up, you trust God again. Every morning you wake up, you look again. You find his presence. Every morning you discover that the God who was faithful yesterday is still here today. Every day. And maybe that is how perseverance is formed. Not through one giant moment of faith, but through thousands of ordinary decisions to look and to keep looking, to keep trusting, to get up every day and keep following, to keep waking up and discovering he's still here. There is plenty of other things Moses could have looked at. He could have looked at all the complaints. He could have looked at the rebellion. He could have looked at the idolatry, the scarcity, the uncertainty, the people who wanted to turn back and go to Egypt, the people who were questioning his leadership, the people that were worshiping golden calves that literally made idols, the years that were passing, the destination that never seemed to get any closer. He could have looked at all of that. 40 years is a long time to keep looking at the same desert. But somewhere along the way, Moses learned something. The wilderness is not evidence that God has abandoned you. God is in the wilderness. The cloud was there every morning. The fire was there every night. The manna was there every day. The presence was there because God was there. And eventually, this is extraordinary, Moses became so hungry for this presence that he even told God in Exodus 33, when God tells him that Israel could continue to the promised land, Moses essentially is like, we're not going without you. He says, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. Think about how much Moses has changed by now. At 40, he wanted to accomplish something for God. At 80, he learns to notice God. And now in the wilderness, Moses discovered he would rather have God in the wilderness than have the promised land without him. That's a man whose vision has changed. He realizes the destination is not the greatest gift anymore. God is. His presence is. That's what 40 years of wilderness finally taught Moses. The goal isn't simply to get out of the wilderness. The goal is to know the God who walks with you through it. And when he falls in love with his presence, he realizes sometimes this God parts the sea. Sometimes this God sends bread. Sometimes this God sends water from a rock. Sometimes he gives you a cloud. Sometimes he gives you a fire. And sometimes nothing about your circumstances changes at all. But through every season, the invitation remains the same. Keep your eyes on me. Egypt taught Moses the limits of his own strength, but Midian taught Moses to notice the presence of God and to look for it everywhere. The wilderness taught him to keep looking, day after day, year after year, until eventually the man who once ran because he was afraid becomes the man Hebrews describes with these words. He persevered because he could see him who is invisible. He kept seeing him. Which brings us back to the question. And this is the question, because something has your eyes, right? Something has your attention. So here's the question, Midtown. What are you looking at? And don't say me. A better question. What has your attention? What has your attention? Because, and you know this, whatever holds your attention eventually shapes your life. If all you see is the doctor's report, fear grows. If all you see is the bank account, anxiety grows. If all you see is the headlines, hopelessness grows. If all you see is your failures, shame grows. If all you see is your circumstances, discouragement grows. What holds your attention eventually shapes what you believe. And that's why the writer of Hebrews doesn't simply say that Moses became fearless. He tells us that Moses saw differently. Faith doesn't ignore reality. That's what he's saying. Faith doesn't pretend that the diagnosis isn't real. Faith doesn't pretend that the bills aren't real, or that the loss isn't real, or that the wilderness isn't real. The visible world is real. It just isn't ultimate. Because there's another reality. There's another kingdom, another king, another presence, one who has been with us the entire time, and he is the invisible God. And once Moses learned to see him, Pharaoh became smaller, the wilderness became less frightening, the future became less uncertain, not because those things disappeared, they didn't, but because Moses could finally see them in relationship to someone greater. And I wonder how many of us spend our days staring at things that cannot save us. We stare at our phones. We stare at the news. We stare at the headlines. We stare at social media. We stare at our calendars. We stare at our problems. We stare at ourselves. And then we wonder why we're exhausted. We live in a world that is constantly competing for our attention. Every notification, every headline, every algorithm, everything's set, every advertisement, right? Just trying to get your time. Everything wants your eyes because everyone knows something about you, that what captures your attention will eventually shape you. Which means that the most countercultural thing a follower of Jesus in this world can do is pay attention to the presence of God. The psalmist says, and I love this, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Why? Because the hills will save him? No. He's reminding himself that his hope comes from the Lord, not from himself, not even from the hills. My help comes from the Lord. He goes, eyes up, eyes up. The Apostle Paul says, set your mind on things above. Not because this world doesn't matter, but because we cannot understand what's happening down here unless we learn to see it from up there. And then Paul says something else, something I absolutely love. In Ephesians chapter 1, he says that your heart, my heart, our hearts, we have eyes on our hearts. Did you know that? Coastal students don't ask that at school. Your heart, because you put it under a microscope here and be like, your heart don't have it. Paul says your heart has eyes. Listen to what he says, Ephesians chapter 1. He says, I pray that the eyes of your heart has eyes. I pray that the eyes of your heart might be enlightened, might be opened, in order, and I love every word of these verses, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you. The hope. Do you understand how much hope you have? There is a God in heaven who's calling your heart. He's put eyes. Paul goes, man, your eyes aren't open. I want your eyes to be open to the hope that you have in him who called you. Can we be honest? We are terrible hopers. Aren't we terrible hopers? Like, just as people, I don't know if you're anything like me, you put your expectations down because then you can't be disappointed, right? You just keep them all down, very subtle, very low. Paul goes, are you kidding me? I pray that the eyes of your heart would be opened, be enlightened to the hope that you have from him who called you. The riches, I love this, the riches of your glory, of his glory. Wait, I'm getting pronouns confused. I want you to see this. This is important if you've not seen it before. The riches of his glorious inheritance. We're so used to calling God our glorious inheritance. Paul says, oh, hold on. You misunderstand how your father sees you. You are his glorious inheritance. He's looking at you the same way. There's a God up in heaven who's looking down at you going, shut up, that's my boy. That's my girl. Oh, I can't wait. His glorious inheritance in his holy people and his incomparably great power for us who believe. He goes on to say that power that you have access to is the same power that brought Jesus back from the dead. He goes, God, would you open their eyes to that? Because their eyes aren't open. Their eyes are closed. The eyes of their hearts are blind. Apparently, there's things your physical eyes cannot see that your heart learns to recognize. And that's what Paul's talking about. He goes, God, open their eyes to it. Open their eyes to the hope and the inheritance and the power and the presence, the reality of who you are. Paul goes, I want their eyes opened so that they can know the hope to which you have called them. Paul goes, it's like, I wish you could see. I wish you could see it. I pray, God, open their eyes. Because they're looking at their circumstances. And I want them to see your power. They're looking at themselves. And I want them to see how you see them. They're looking at what is visible. I want them to look at what is ultimate. Open the eyes of their hearts. And suddenly, we're right back where we started. Hebrews says Moses persevered because he could see him who was invisible. That's it. That's how Moses made it. Not because Moses was extraordinary, not because Moses never got tired, not because Moses never got angry, we know full well he did, not because he never got discouraged, not because he understood everything that God was doing at all times. Moses persevered because he learned where to look. The eyes of his heart, to say it another way, had been opened. Egypt taught him the limits of his own strength. Midian taught him to notice the presence of God. The burning bush taught him to turn aside and notice. The wilderness taught him to keep looking day after day after day until eventually seeing God became the way that Moses saw everything else. And maybe that's what mature faith looks like. Not ignoring what's in front of you, but seeing in light of who is with you. So, church, could it be that the greatest need in your life is not different circumstances, but different vision? Maybe you've been asking God to change what you're looking at, and God wants to change the way you're looking. Faith has never been about pretending things aren't hard, right? Abraham still had to wait. Sarah still laughed. Noah still built a boat. Moses still wandered. Faith didn't remove the struggle. Faith gave them someone greater than the struggle. That's why they persevered. Not because they're extraordinary, but because God was. And he still is. The invisible God is not absent. He is simply unseen by physical eyes. And that's why Paul prays, open the eyes of their hearts. Help us, God. Help us see you. Help us recognize you. Help us notice where you're already at work. Help us see the wilderness differently because you're in the wilderness. just as you're in the future. Help us to see the future differently because you're already in the future. Help us see ourselves differently because we belong to you. Help us see our circumstances differently because they are real, but they are not ultimate. You are. And now I want you to go back with me one more time. Back to the mountain. In fact, let's close our eyes. Can we lower the lights? Back to the mountain from the beginning. Moses is 120 years old. He's standing on Mount Nebo. His journey is almost done. He's about to take a seat. Below him, the promised land. Behind him, 120 years of life. Egypt and Midian and Pharaoh and the Red Sea and the wilderness and the manna and the failures and the victories, the funerals, the disappointments, the presence of God throughout it all. And Moses knows that he isn't going any further. This is the end. In a few moments, God's enormously gentle hands will cross Moses' arms across his chest for burial. Joshua will finish what Moses started. Another generation will cross the Jordan. Moses is going to die on this mountain. And yet, after everything, Deuteronomy tells us, his eye was undimmed. After all of it, the highs and the lows, the good and the bad, he could still see. He could still see the Lord. That's how I want to finish. I don't mean physically. I want to come to the end of my life after whatever comes, after victories and disappointments, after prayers that God answers the way I hope, after prayers that he answers differently than how I hope, after mountaintops, after valleys, after wilderness. I want to arrive at the end and still somehow have my eyes, still be able to see God, still able to recognize his presence, still able to believe that he is good, still able to trust that his story continues beyond mine, still able to look toward a future I may never personally inhabit and believe that God will be faithful there too. In church, you can lose a lot of things in the wilderness. Don't lose your eyes. So this week, may we slow down. May we turn aside. May we pay attention. Before you reach for your phone in the mornings, can you take just 1 minute and pray, Lord, open the eyes of my heart. Where are you already at work today? Take a walk without AirPods. Put the phone away. Be quiet. Notice. Look. Because the God Moses met in the wilderness is still meeting people in their wildernesses. The invisible God is not absent. He is nearer than you think. He's been nearer than you realized. And so whatever this week holds, whatever you're walking through, whatever is comparing and competing for your attention, whatever wilderness lies in front of you, eyes up. Keep looking. Because the God who was faithful to Moses is still faithful today.